Well, welcome everybody once again to the Biographer's Chair. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite artists, Lucio Fontana. And today I'm joined by Professor Anthony White, who is the author of Lucio Fontana Between Utopia and Kitsch. Welcome, Anthony, to the show.
Thank you very much, John. Great to be here.
And it's great to have you. And I've got a few facts about you, which I hope are right.
Okay,
Uh, You hold a master's from the University of Melbourne and a PhD from Harvard.
correct.
You were a high level curator at the National Gallery in Australia, where you managed, amongst other things, the Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles. And you are involved in a research project called Mapping Creativity in Captivity During World War II, a project looking at how art was produced under the constraints of war.
Correct.
So that's so the audience know you a little bit better. And getting on to Lucio Fontana,
Mm.
what we know about his past, how does it shape his art?
Well, it shapes it in a lot of important ways. But before I answer that, I should say that we probably still don't know everything about Lucio Fontana.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we may never know everything about Lucio Fontana. And that's true about most artists, but it's particularly true for him because of things that happened in the period between the wars. He appears to have been involved in the fascist party in Italy. And like a lot of young men his age, remember he was born in 1899.
Mm-hmm.
So he's right on the, perfect age in World War One to be affected by the historical events that involved and what that led to, which in short was the rise of this disaffected, grievance-driven fascist party. So we know some things about his involvement. He wasn't a central member of the fascist party. He was a fellow traveller, but little drips and drops have come out over the years. We used to know almost nothing because it was hidden. What we know about him in particular that's important for understanding his art is, first of all, that he was trained as a classical sculptor. His father was a sculptor. He had this his upbringing in his own family, like in the olden days, everybody was trained by their dad into whatever profession their father happened to be in. And that's why we had so many male artists and so few female artists until recently. And so he learnt the craft of being a sculptor, so making funerary sculptures, monuments that appear in cemeteries. And then he went to the Accademia in Milan, which is where he lived in the early part of his life. So he had that classical education. He had that kind of traditional artisan education through his father. But the other important thing to understand about Fontana, apart from his training and his involvement with fascism, is also that he lived between two countries in a sense. He was actually born in Argentina and to Italian parents. And there were a lot of Italians in Argentina at the time. It was a big part of a big Italian community. And he went backwards and forwards between the two countries until 47, after World War II, when he spent the next 20 years exclusively in Italy and mostly in Milan. So, there's a lot of other things I could say, but I suppose those are some of the things that make him an interesting person,
Yeah.
not what you expect. And there are different sides to his personality and I think those things affected him. And he was obviously affected. I suppose one more thing to say is after World War II, he was deeply affected by the kind of enormous explosion in consumer culture and in the sort of whole economic boom that happened in Italy after the war, that whole made in Italy thing. So he really grasped that nettle, using bright colors, using new materials, plastic, very innovative as a designer of
Mm-hmm.
art. So he's really part of, and usually it's difficult often to separate art and design, and that's what makes it interesting. And I guess that's the last thing I would say is an important thing to understand about his background.
Yeah, that's what I love about him is his use of material and talking about that. How did his training as a sculptor? influences use of material and space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, he was trained to produce figurative, by which I mean, representations of the human form in permanent material. So that would be marble or bronze. He made plenty of terracotta sculptures, but they were mostly models for later, more permanent structures. So he grew up with that whole sense of I'm making a permanent artwork that's going to be a monument, it's going to commemorate something, and it's going to last forever, for hundreds of
Mm,
years.
mm,
And so he's got that background, and he's also got the whole idea of art as a physical practice. So, rather than thinking about art as a philosophical thing initially, his art was very much grounded in the physical material basis of it, whether it be bronze or terracotta or marble. And, that idea of being a sculptor really that was his bread and butter for the first sort of 40 years of his
mm,
career, or 30 years of his career. And then what's interesting is he really kind of goes from one extreme to the other. He's making classical sculptures, let's just say. That's a bit of a generalization, but in the sense of
mm.
like a monument. And then suddenly what happens after World War II, he just kind of switches and starts making these completely strange, impermanent things. So, for example, he was already projecting in 1947 the idea of an artwork made purely of light. No permanent structure, no commemoration, no monument, no sort of permanent physical structure, because he was thinking very deeply during the war, after what he went through. You've got to think about what people of his generation went through in the 40s, right? He was living in Argentina, so he didn't see the worst of it. But he witnessed, sort of from afar, his hometown being bombed.
Mm.
In 44, Milan was bombed, so the cathedral wasn't affected, but major parts of the city were bombed. Italy lost the war, and he was nationalistic. He was proud of his country, and it was a terrible defeat for a lot of Italian men and women, and there was a lot of suffering, and then Italy was plunged into this crisis and so forth. So I think maybe being somewhat distant from that catastrophe, the end of fascism, everything was terrible, right? Being
Yeah,
somewhat
yeah.
distant from it enabled him perhaps to kind of go, okay, all bets are off. Like, that's it. We're not making monuments anymore. Forget
Mm,
about it. Like, because that's just terrible. And it represents, a period that we need to leave behind. So he then started with young students. He was always feeding off younger people, his younger students, because he taught in Argentina. And I think together they sort of generated this new idea. Okay, let's make art out of light. Let's make art out of radar. Let's make art out of television.
yeah.
He sort of threw everything over at some point. And that's sort of his claim to fame now, and is behind a lot of his later work, such as the paintings for which he's most famous. It's
Yeah.
not visible really to the naked eye, but actually you need to understand all that stuff to understand his later famous slashed and cut paintings.
Do you think that's where the his impermanence comes from? He sees his city destroyed. He knows that, like, because when you live in a family home, you think it's going to last forever, and then he sees it completely destroyed, and he
Oh
suddenly
yeah,
thinks, well, nothing is permanent now.
I think so. And there are famous photographs of him because remember he's in Milan up until 1940.
Mm,
So he spends the first part of his life in Argentina, then moves to Milan. And then later in life, he's already sort of 30, 40 by this point. He goes back to Argentina during the war. When he comes back in 47, he had an existing practice. So he sort of thought, okay, the horror show is over. I can kind of start again.
mm,
But there are famous photos of him going back to the building where his studio was, and it's just in rubble.
mm,
And there's this kind
yeah.
of ground zero idea that okay, like everything is off. And sculpture, uh, it was sort of like Mussolini's favorite art form, for obvious reasons. Make a monument in bronze to me, and so I suppose there's a point at which you hear Fontana saying, art has just become a tool of power and it's after the war. He's like, I'm not, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. So yes, I think it's the destruction, but I also think it's the disillusionment about what I call the instrumentalization of art. That is to say, art as a useful thing. That he really believed that art wasn't there to serve like that kind of base purpose of promoting an idea or sending a message. He really thought art was there to kind of overturn everything and to liberate ourselves from settled concepts. And that's where he ended up at the end of his life. And that's why it's famous now.
It seems like his life reflected his art because coming back to Italy, he's got to start all over again, and he starts his art all over again.
He
So
does, it's ironic that he's really famous for these paintings, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but
yeah,
his first painting is produced when he's already 50, right? And,
mm,
back in the 50s and 60s, that's already quite old. Like
yeah,
obviously life expectancy has increased since then. So he's already kind of a middle-aged or late middle-aged person, and all of a sudden painting. But the
mm,
sculpture is in the painting, and he brings a
yeah,
sculptural sensibility to the painting. And I should also say that his sculpture before that was although he did a lot of he was a gun for hire. He had to make money
yeah,
in some distasteful ways that we would now say, oh gosh, like why did you do that? We can't second guess maybe people's motivations. You have to be there to know like what the whys and wherefores.
mm,
But he was actually quite experimental as a sculptor as well. He had kind of two-track career. He would do experimental stuff on the one hand, bizarre ceramic sculptures that were abstract and looked like they were made out of glitter and filth. Like
yeah,
just really in the 30s, under Mussolini, this is happening. And then he's also making propaganda for the fascist party. So it's quite
yeah,
weird.
yeah. I like his terracotta sculptures. Yeah, it's a bit different, and it's a bit out there.
They're so odd. You can't believe they're actually being produced at the time. And even even now, you look at them and you go, actually, that's just weird. What are you doing? Like
Yeah.
what? They're just so there's these, it's supposed to be a depiction of a butterfly. I've been to Switzerland to see these works where there's a big collector, has a lot of them.
Mm,
Um, Name is Bischofberger. He's a very famous collector. He was in that film about Julian Schnabel, if anybody's interested in that sort of thing. So he's a big collector. He collected all this Fontana stuff. You've got this big sculpture of a butterfly, and you think, oh, well, it should be light and airy and colourful and all that. It's this kind of pile of muck, in the shape of a butterfly, covered in iridescent glaze, sort of like shot silk, so that it looks like it's sort of quivering and glistening as you move around it's like this sort of underwater pile of tumescent jelly. Like it's just so odd, and you can't believe it. And then you think, gee, this is produced in 1939 in fascist Italy. So he is an incredible character.
And how was his art received, both the sculptures and the
Mm.
paintings that he was doing at the time?
Well, if I were him, I wouldn't have read the reviews. Some people say don't read your critics, don't feed the trolls, right? He had his supporters. This is the tricky thing: is that when you look at a period like the 1920s and 30s in Italy, so Mussolini's in power, and there's a kind of an official art. It's not like in Germany where Hitler and the National Socialist idea of art was extremely strict and rigid, and it was just like black and white
Hmm.
classical art or you're out, and it was if you're out, you were seriously out, like in big trouble. In Italy, the thing was a little bit different. Mussolini's strategy to build consensus to get everybody to agree with fascism was basically to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but I'm going to control the media and all the political parties and basically everything else. But culture, it's sort of like off you go. Have your debates, and once you two fight it out and see who wins. So that was his sort of approach. So within that pluralism of art, but not pluralism in politics or information or media or anything like that, to be absolutely clear. And, terrible things happen under fascism in Italy. But let's just say that, like, that's absolutely important that everybody understands.
Yeah.
At the same time, in the cultural domain, you know, particularly early on, like up until about 935, there was a lot of experimentation. And so it was possible for an artist to be doing things. And so what would happen is you'd be doing something modern. You'd be doing something surrealism. You'd be doing cubism. You'd be doing expressionism or something that you'd invented, which didn't exist, abstract art even. There was abstract art.
Mm.
in mid-30s in the north of Italy. So, and it was being, now there were there were your mates who would champion you, or your critics who would champion you. Even people in high places, they go, oh yeah,
Mm.
I mean, some people even said, Mussolini said fascism is a revolution. So he did say that.
Mm.
Whatever you think of it, sort of
Yeah.
like contradictory, but that's what he said. Uh, and then they said that then the abstract artist, Osvaldo Licini, said, then we need revolutionary art. If
Yeah.
fascism is a revolution. So, that's how they kind of justified. So up until about 35, there was a lot of expressionist art, futurism sort of kept going right through. And then there was modernism and so forth. So Fontana could kind of exist. And then there was terrible criticism. So pretty much from about 936, so 36 is really the turning point. It's the peak of Mussolini's popularity, but then there's sanctions are imposed, not to get into the weeds too much, but it is a turning point. When they invade
Yeah.
Ethiopia, then the League of Nations put sanctions on Italy and things start to turn. And then, there's a sequence of events following that,
Hmm.
gets closer to Hitler. There's the racial laws come in, so Jewish people are not allowed to hold positions of power and so forth, 38, and on it goes, and it gets worse and worse. And it's so that there's a complexity to when you're talking about Fontana criticism, there's people saying it's terrible and there's people saying I love it.
Yeah.
But in the later 30s, it gets harder and harder. And he didn't actually leave Italy because of fascism or anything like that. That's what everybody used to say, all the kind of Fontana fanboys and girls would say, oh, he must have left because, fascism. That wasn't the reason. There just wasn't enough work.
Yeah.
His dad was still practicing in Argentina in Buenos Aires, so he moved there and he said, "Hey, have you got some work for me?" And actually, his dad said, "No, like piss off."
Mhm.
Thanks, Dad. Then he had to make it on his own, and which he did. So
Yeah.
that was the situation. His reception kind of had a moment there, and then later on, people look back in the 40s, people go, "Wow, Fontana, wow, look what you did." But a lot of stuff had disappeared by then. It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
really just in publications. It had all been destroyed because his studio was destroyed, and there was a few collectors that had stuff. So yeah, I mean, his reputation now is gone through the absolute roof. But when I started
Mm.
writing about Fontana, I mean, I can remember people saying to me when I started my doctoral dissertation on Fontana, which was the basis for this book, a couple of people were like, "What are you writing about that for? This stuff's terrible."
Yeah.
And you kind of go, oh, maybe they're right. No, it's great. I love it. So you just keep going. And his reputation has totally changed. So now we just
Yeah.
don't, I mean, the price of his work are just astronomical, astronomical.
Well, talking about Argentina, what was the White Manifesto and how did it affect his work, if at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just briefly, if you sat down to read the White Manifesto, it would give you a headache. It's quite, you can tell it's been written by a committee. There are a couple of basic ideas. So to understand it just quickly, so it was signed by a bunch of Fontana's students at the Alto Mira Academy in Buenos Aires, where he was teaching, and he hadn't signed it. And that's always
Mhm.
been a bit of a mystery because later it was like, oh, that's my manifesto. That's where all my ideas came from. Um, there were some ideas in that manifesto, though, that it's clear that you can tell from things he was saying earlier and things he said afterwards, you can tell that it's got his handprints all over it. And some of those ideas are things like when he says, Baroque art was the moment when art started to have an ambition to invade space. So you think about Bernini, and the marvelous way in which, Apollo and Daphne, these figures, they kind of
Yeah.
reach out into the space to touch you almost, or even the paintings at St. Ignatius Church in Rome, looks like, these angels are falling out of the sky, they're about to drop onto your
Mm.
face. Right? I mean, that's Fontana's ambition. He loved that
Mm.
idea of art and space joining as one. And he developed that later on. Also, what's key
Mhm.
in the White Manifesto, that's where you see us this kind of idea that no, art is dead. Like the traditional art is dead. We have to get rid of paintings. We have to get rid of sculptures. We have to go into a new art. And it's going to be made out of all sorts of things like color and light. And he hadn't quite figured out what it was going to look like
Mm.
yet. And so it was sort of like the founding document of what would become the spatialist movement. So yeah, when you kind of connect the ambition of the Baroque and then the kind of ambition to leave behind traditional art and to use new technology, you start to see references to science and things, which was sort of in the air at the time, right? After
Yeah.
World War II. So yeah, it's a bit of a yeah. But what I can tell you is, I went to Buenos Aires to do research for the book, and kind of have to go to the artist's birthplace because you feel
Mm.
like you're going to pick up some gem, and you normally do. And one of the gems I picked up was Julia Kozice, who's a Hungarian artist who was around at the time, concrete artist who experimented with new technology. I asked him about this because he was around then in
Oh, wow.
1946 when the White Manifesto was written. I said, these students, so how do they come up with that? And he goes, oh my God, are you kidding me? Those guys were babies. There's no way they wrote that manifesto. So yeah, I'm going to say it's Fontana's manifesto, but he just sort of asked them to sign it. But it's important to stress that Fontana was a great promoter of young artists,
Yeah.
from a middle age. Not every artist is good at that. Like he was a wonderful
Mm.
mentor. And, I think it speaks to his kind of flexibility and openness and kind of
Mm.
modernity, that he was really open to the new thing. At the age of 50, he's kind of totally turning his whole career upside down.
Well, you said about him moving away from sculpture, and he had this dissatisfaction with traditional ways. What do you think that he thought was missing from the old ways?
Yeah, I think the key thing for Fontana was that from quite early on, it was partly to do with his exposure to debates about the relationship between art and architecture, which came out of the debates in the Bauhaus. So many people will know, the Bauhaus, which was a famous design school in Germany in the 20s, which led to really revolutionary thinking about how art and architecture and design and industry could kind of all combine to
Mm.
basically change the world, right? So
Yeah.
these ideas were in the air. So Fontana, he's in his 20s and 30s when these ideas are coming out. So he's
Mm.
receptive. And you think, oh, like in Italy, it's far away from Germany and it's kind of fascist. So no. But actually, these ideas were filtering down through Switzerland and into Milan, which is quite close. It's not that far from
Mm.
Austria, not that far from Germany. So he's got those ideas. And this is something, the idea of mural painting, for example, in the 20s
Yeah.
and 30s, the whole world was talking about Mexico, New York, Australia. We're all talking about mural painting, the idea of art and architecture.
Mm.
So that's one important piece of the puzzle that you need to understand. The other important piece of the puzzle is, and so there was already these debates. What I'm trying to say is that, this idea of a painting in a frame stuck on a wall, isolated from the world around it, is dead. That's got to
Mm.
go. And the same goes with sculpture. You can't put a thing on a pedestal and worship it and go, oh, back into it, by mistake, it's in the way. Like this idea.
Mm.
No, it's got to be part of a complex. Because if art just becomes like a pimple on a pumpkin, it's a sort of a thing there. It's not connected in a meaningful way to the world around it. It's sort of useless and it doesn't have a function anymore. But artists in
Mm.
the 20s and 30s, like Fontana, were thinking about, and his abstract sculpture of the 30s produced these two-dimensional works that were three-dimensional so that they actually were integrated with the wall behind them, visually speaking.
Mm.
So he
Yeah.
tried to incorporate the wall. So I think all those ideas, the idea that art needs to be more connected to the physical space around it and also to the society around it, and the artwork shouldn't be an isolated, unique kind of fetish object that is sort of cut off. Gradually, that was brewing away in his mind. And then when the war happened, he sort of goes back into his shell for a while and then comes out of it at the end in 46, 47, and goes, well, actually, let's put these ideas into practice. So that's
Mm.
when you start to see the real change happening. So he experimented with lots of ways of trying to solve the fundamental problem of the art of the second half of his career, which was how can I make art closer to space?
Is,
And I
is
don't mean outer space, but there's
Yeah.
some of that, but it's like space in the room around me, in the street, in the gallery,
Yeah.
in the building, whatever, or just in a kind of an abstract sense. And he wanted to create an artwork where there would be no distinction between the artwork and the space around it, which is
Yeah.
pretty actually conceptually impossible in a way. but he sort of did it. He achieved it, but in an unexpected way later on in his career.
Is that what he meant by spatialism? Is that how he created the spatialist movement?
Yeah, yeah. So I can go through just a couple of examples that
Hmm. Yeah.
illustrate what it meant. So we've understood that he said no more sculpture on a pedestal, no painting in a frame, forget about it. So let's create works in the 40s. When he comes back to Milan, it's a whole new world. Let's start again, ground zero. So he starts making works out of neon,
Hmm.
out of fluorescent tubing, starts making works out of so a sculpture made out of paper mache that's suspended in a dark room, all the lights off, and it's bombarded with ultraviolet light. So when you
Mm.
walk into the space, and nobody really done this before, the
Yeah.
artwork wasn't the sculpture, it was the whole room. So when you walked into this
Mm.
room, and it's like nowadays going into a disco.
Yeah.
I mean, now it's sort of a pedestrian thing, but back then it was quite an unusual thing to do. You walk into the room, all you can see is this fluorescent blob, sort of, you can't quite make sense of it because the fluorescent
Mm.
paint and the ultraviolet light in combination mess with your idea of understanding what three-dimensional objects look like because it takes away the shadows and things. And then your clothing would glow, like when you wear a white
Yeah.
shirt. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that would glow. So then you had actually become part of the artwork. So the whole artwork was
Mm.
really the space around the work and also the viewer.
Yeah.
That's the thing that was called the spatial ambient of 1949, which was shown in Milan. So this was a sort of prototype. Then he produced a couple of works using fluorescent tubing, famously at the Triennale or the Triennial of Milan Design and Architecture, which was held every obviously 3 years. He did this huge sculpture which was made out of 100 meters of fluorescent tubing, and it's just a great big tangle. I mean, you just like, how did he come up with this stuff? It's like a
Mm.
ball, like a tangle of wool or something. Um, and it's huge and suspended from the ceiling. And as you walk around it, it changes. It doesn't, because you can't really make sense of it from whatever
Yeah.
angle. So again, the viewer is sort of involved. So he tried, that was called the spatial concept. So this was the way in which he tried to realize the idea of spatialism or the idea of a spatial artwork.
Mm.
And, the idea of it was that he thought, oh, I'm going to do this in sculpture. But over the years, he realized, it's still not spatial enough. It's still a thing hanging from the ceiling. How can
Mm.
I make it more spatial? So he tried all sorts of different things. He tried ceramic sculptures that have very fluorescent reflective glaze on them, so you sort of can't make out what they are, and light flashes off them because of the
Mm.
reflection, so forth. But eventually, he came to the paradoxical conclusion that the perfect medium for creating a spatial artwork in which the object would become one with the space around it was in easel painting,
Mm.
which
Yeah.
sounds completely paradoxical and crazy. But when you understand how he thought about it and think about it in what I think is the correct way, it's totally obvious. It just requires a bit of explanation. That's all. And it took him decades to kind of arrive at this. And remember, he'd never done a painting, so he's sort of doing painting in an irreverent way, like using it for a purpose that wasn't intended.
Yeah. And I suppose if you're a part of if the art, everybody is experiencing that art in a different way,
Yeah,
and which is fascinating. It's
he
exciting.
loved that. Yeah, he loved that idea because he
Yeah.
he often said, I don't want to push anything down your throat. I don't want you to present you with this thing and you have to kind of respect it or worship it.
Mm.
I want the viewer to be engaged in the work because
Yeah.
actually the reality is the artwork doesn't stop at the frame. The artwork doesn't, the whole world in some way is an artifact. Like the whole, well, the urban world, the civilization that we live in, everything is kind of designed or is affected by design or by
Yeah.
human intervention. And so, in a sense, what he's saying is, why should we have artworks for a few wealthy people so they can have beautiful lives when
Mm.
actually what we should be doing is making the whole world beautiful? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the most utopia. That's why I use the word utopia in the
Yeah.
book, because there was a utopian dimension. Like he wasn't a socialist in the sense of he was far from being a socialist actually, but he was a utopian. He definitely, at certain points, he really believed this is going to change everything. We're going to make
Yeah.
the world completely different. We're going to make people think completely differently because of this artwork. The other side of the title, while I'm on the topic, kitsch, is that he actually used kitsch materials. And what I
Yeah.
mean by that is shiny, colourful,
Mm.
redolent of times past to sort of bring the artwork down to earth and make it less high and mighty or highfalutin or anodyne. He wanted to make it earthy. He wanted to make it fun. He wanted to make it celebrating the kind of worldliness of
Yeah.
experience. And so the kitsch aspect is not a criticism. It's actually a sort of like, I mean, think about pop art, I suppose, is the obvious. If you think about Warhol, it doesn't seem quite fair to say that he's a kitsch artist, right? So it's the same
Mm.
sense in Fontana. It's kind of using that mass cultural domain to sort of make a point about like how the world could be different. We could think about the world differently.
Yeah. Make it less snobby, really.
Precisely, yeah.
Mm.
Because the
Yeah.
materials he was using, I mean, hot pink, right? Like I'm talking shocking hot pink, the sort of thing, A, wasn't available before the war
Mm.
because synthetic pigments and synthetic binders, which are the oil that carries the pigment in a paint film, just weren't available. You couldn't have such bright colors. So it's a sign of modernity at one level. But, hot pink painting by Fontana, which he did
Mm.
plenty of, and lots of other crazy colors as well, they really belong to the world of fashion and celebrity in Hollywood. Jane Mansfield,
Yeah.
I don't know if people know who she is, but she's a celebrity, I don't know, blonde bombshell. I'm trying to think of an
Yeah.
appropriate
That's
term,
probably
right?
the best way to describe it. Yeah.
Bright pink, bright pink car, bright pink dress, probably bright pink poodle or whatever. Anyway, it's that kind of celebrity culture. And Fontana's like, that's what I want. Because I want
Yeah.
my work to be part of the world that what people are interested in. He used glitter, he used
Yeah.
sequins, he used crushed chunks of Murano glass. So Murano is an island in the lagoon in Venice where there's this famous kind of glass manufacturing, but it has its kind of cheap side, right? It's kind of kitsch
Mm.
side, like glitzy sort of chandeliers and stuff. So he's importing all that stuff into these works, which at the same time are deeply philosophical. Like his spatial concepts, paintings from the 50s and 60s are deeply philosophical works, where he slices open a monochrome canvas, like a canvas with
Mm.
one layer of color all the same, and then you
Yeah.
cut a hole in it. So it's like, hang on, the canvas is supposed to represent space, but now you put a hole. What are you doing? Like you put a hole, where's the space now? But
Mm.
then there's all this kitsch stuff all over it as well. So it's completely bonkers. I mean, he's very hard to categorize, and I think that's one of the appealing things about him. And he never really, I mean, he kind of got stuck in a groove because they were so popular and so good, the slashed paintings or the tagli, as they're cuts to say in English, they're called. But they were good. I mean, he'd figured out how to solve the problem of the spatial artwork with this
Yeah.
cut painting.
By using the space behind the artwork through the slash.
Yeah, well, I mean, if any of you can imagine a Fontana painting, I mean, you can just kind of spell it out. I saw a cartoon in the New Yorker the other day, and it's got two cats looking at a painting on the wall, and it's got four slices in it. It looks like somebody's got the big claw and gone like that and
Mm.
sliced four cuts in the painting, and it's got nothing else on it. And one cat says to the other cat, I could have done that. But anyway, there's the picture in your mind. So a cut in a painting, he's cut with a Stanley knife. So it just sort of peels open to reveal what's behind. He actually kind of puts a bit of black
Yeah.
gauze behind there to suggest a sort of like abstract idea of space. So in those cut paintings, right, you remember his idea was I want to create an artwork which is made of space. Couldn't do it, right? Because
Yeah.
you can't have a thing that's made of space. It just doesn't, it's like a contradiction in terms. But in a painting, because it's illusionistic, the slash, if there's a single slash in the middle of a monochrome painting, you read the monochrome as in all color, like let's say it's blue, you read that blue
Mm.
as space. But then there's a cut in the middle of it with a black gauze behind it, which looks just like empty space. That's a thing sort of visually floating in this field of blue. So then the thing in the painting is made out of space, literally.
Yeah.
So he's made a artwork out of space. So there's sort of the logic that I apply to understanding his work, and that's why I think he spent so many
Mm.
years making it. The other interesting thing about the cut paintings, if I may just continue that thought
Yeah.
briefly, his very first cut paintings were actually punched with holes. He started shining lights. So get a canvas, stretch it, punch it with. He used tools that he would use in the sculptor's studio. That's the other funny thing, rather than
Mm.
brushes and stuff. Like he'd dip the painting in paint and then punch it with a awl or something, which is a sculptor's tool. And then
Hmm.
he had all these holes, and he's like, "What am I going to do with that?" He got a lamp, and then he would shine the lamp onto the holes on the canvas, and then project the light onto the wall behind, and then take a photograph of that and said, "Hey, look at this. This is a spatial artwork." But what you could see on the
Mm.
wall were the little holes in the painting acted as pinhole camera lenses, effectively.
Mm.
So you would see an image of the filament in the lamp projected onto the wall. So it was sort of like this projection of technology as well as the sort of idea of spatial artwork. Then he said that those were television broadcasts, and went around saying, "I just made a television broadcast." So for years, people said, "Oh, he was the first artist to make television." Well, the researcher unfortunately had to go and spoil a party, because I went to the RAI, which is the radio television organization in Rome, and I checked the schedule. There was no television broadcast by Fontana. It may have been planned and never carried out. Um, but it's a cool idea. And again,
Yeah.
it's making art part of space. What could be more spatial than a television broadcast, right?
And why did he move from puncturing the canvas to slashing it? Was it
Yeah,
just
it's a
a
good
progression?
kind of. I mean,
Mm.
there's a story about it, and I always think these now. I don't know if you do this, but we all like to tell stories about ourselves to make ourselves more digestible, because actually the reality is usually kind of messy. I don't know what actually happened, because I obviously wasn't there, but he says that uh, he was producing these punctured paintings for quite a while, and he's putting glitter on them, putting chunks of Murano glass and putting sand on them and globs of this and that. And
Mm.
around about 58, he showed up at the Venice Biennale with a bunch of these paintings and said, "Here," and they go, "Yeah, great, these are great." Um, and then he just had this sort of crisis where he said, "This is all terrible." And people were starting to say, "Man, you've been doing this for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Now you're just getting like a mannerist of like avant-garde." So, the story goes that he actually cut one of his paintings in frustration, and sort of, but I don't believe that's true. But it is a progression, because obviously from a hole to a cut. But the other thing I think that happened was he was getting on, right? So he's
Mm.
58, 57 by this point, and there's a few young'uns coming up underneath him and doing stuff, doing weird stuff that he would have done if he was that age, but he
Mm.
wasn't. So there was an artist called Eve Klein. So Eve Klein produced,
I love Eve Klein. Yeah.
right? So just for those who don't know, he just produced blue paintings with nothing on them, same color all over, bit
Hmm.
of texture, made with a roller, and said, this is a sort of this is a specialization of aesthetic sensibility, impregnated onto a canvas, and here's your like artwork,
Mm.
and that's all it is, just a rectangle of color. They're incredibly beautiful. When you see them in reproduction or think about them, you think, "Oh, it's just a joke," but actually they're incredibly beautiful. They're absolutely sumptuous, saturated pigment. You can't They're beautiful. So, these were exhibited in Milan in 1957. One of the first times they were ever exhibited. Klein was not Italian. He was from Paris, or actually not from Paris, but anyway, he was French. So he exhibited there, and Fontana went to that exhibition and bought one. So
Mm.
57,
Wow.
he's got one of these monochrome paintings, and he must have been sitting there looking at it in his lounge room going, "Hang on a minute, you know, I need to up the ante here." So
Mm.
I think his slash paintings are really a response to Klein,
Yeah.
because he knew that Klein was onto something. And what he was onto was the idea that art is actually just a concept at the end of the day.
Mm.
And then you had conceptual art. And what I mean by that is if you have a rectangle of color, I mean, it's beautiful, but actually what it questions is what is art? Like if that can be art,
Mm.
what is art? And what is it even for? So Fontana was also, that's why he was calling his work spatial concept. He was thinking about this is a concept of a spatial artwork, but also he was also thinking, what is art? He started talking about art being, I think I said this earlier, but he talked a lot in the 50s and 60s about the death of art. He really thought it
Yeah.
was going to end. And these were like the last paintings in a sense, or the last possible paintings. The next painting would have to be, the dream of the spatial artwork, which,
Mm.
maybe was realized later on. We can talk about that, but not in Fontana's lifetime, I don't think.
Yeah, when you talk about it like that, it's his slash paintings were an Eve Klein painting with a slash in it.
In a sense,
Yeah,
except the difference
yeah.
is
It seemed that way.
Fontana, yeah, that's true. So they're a negation of Klein.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason they're a negation, so Klein is saying, all I have to do is put some pigment on a canvas and there you are. And then he would dress up in all these ridiculous outfits and put white gloves and do this performance. And then he would say, come to the opening, and then you'll get a blue cocktail and and there would be guards and there would be blue balloons and someone would light up the Eiffel Tower with blue light. Like it was this kind of, well, what are you doing? You're sort of pulling my
Yeah.
leg a little bit here. Like he would say, every painting, which is exactly the same, because all of these blue rectangles are pretty much identical with some minor, like, inflections of the roller or whatever. And he'd say, oh, but they're all different prices because they all have a different distillation of aesthetic sensibility impregnated into the surface. Once you start saying that, you're going, hang on a minute, right? Like, you can't tell with Klein if he's pulling a leg
Yeah.
or believes his own height. I mean, it's actually hard to tell. Maybe he himself didn't know. He's
Maybe, yeah.
kind of,
Maybe
what's the word? He's sort of like, I don't know. It's like trolling almost. It's quite weird. So
it
then Fontana looks
maybe
at
that
that and goes,
maybe that's just sorry, maybe that's just a part of the art. Maybe that the whole performance is like a
that's
part
right.
of another piece of art.
That's part of it. And another
Mm.
part of the art is the whole idea whether it is art. Like he's incorporated, there's something Duchamp did like
Mm.
decades earlier, but Duchamp had been sort of, it's sort of been forgotten and then was sort of coming back into view in this period. So, I mean, I don't think Klein is an equal of Duchamp, but there is an aspect of Klein's practice which is saying, what the hell is this? Like, you need to think about it. And what is the definition of art? Is it because it's in a gallery? Like he did a work which was the void, it had nothing in it. He just
Yeah.
emptied the gallery, took everything out and said, I've impregnated the specialized aesthetic sensibility into the empty space. So he's sort of going with where Fontana is. But Fontana is like, okay, I've got to respond. But he
Yeah.
responds in an interesting way. He doesn't go further, actually. He doesn't want to go further down that path of sort of like negating the physicality of the artwork. He actually reintroduces it. And I think importantly, it's the violence of the cup. It's that negation of like, yes, but no. We need to
Yeah.
retain the human action and also it's the artisanal thing.
Mm.
He had that artisanal background and the craft background from his father, and working in the academy and all that, practicing as a sculptor for years. I think the cuts are actually that sign of I'm a craft person. I'm making this thing. I'm not creating just a concept, but my craft object has a conceptual or philosophical dimension to it. I know it sounds like a minor distinction, but I think it's kind of like saying, I don't know, AI can replace humans. I mean, sort of like we can't do that, right?
Mm.
Fontana is
Hmm.
pushing back against where Klein is sort of leading. I think that's how I look at it anyway.
In that mode of thinking that you're describing, is that, do you think, why the punctuations became slashes? Because when he was puncturing something, it was frantic. It was
Mm,
seemed uncontrolled, where the slash seems very
mhm.
controlled.
Yeah, there is that. I think he, I think you've got it absolutely right. The shift that happens is between the sense of spontaneity and the punctured paintings,
Mm.
although some of them are quite planned as well. But when they're not looking spontaneous, they look kind of casual.
Mm.
But the cuts are different. They look calculated.
Yeah.
They're elegant. They're exquisite. They're very fine paintings. And what the thing to understand is that that transition, which happens around the time he starts doing the moving from one to the other, I mean, most people will be familiar with Jackson Pollock. So, in the
Yeah.
50s, there was Jackson Pollock doing this kind of splash and dash painting, which is, about the unconscious, and it's about the physical body, and it's about the kind of chaos of the human life in this, cosmic, crazy world that we live in.
Mm.
But one thing that happened with that is there were a lot of imitators. So everybody was making, I can do that, I'm going to make this loopy, drippy painting, which is spontaneous. And there was a lot of existentialism in that. Oh, I'm struggling with the materials, and this is my authentic being, and blah. And that got very stale. It became shop
Mm.
worn or something, window damage, something like that. And in the later 50s, artists were looking for something different. So you have neo-dada in America, where artists are starting to look back to Duchamp, and you think of Rauschenberg, who was starting to use mechanical transferring photographs onto the painting and incorporating. So there was a move towards a more sort of mechanical, more industrial aesthetic in the later 50s, and then into the 60s, it gets really strong. So Fontana is really responding to a kind of exhaustion with this, I guess, reaction against technology in a sense, or against the machine that goes on in that kind of spontaneous art, of which his punches are an expression, and moves it
Mm.
into what is a more mechanical and mechanical in a good sense, because what I think he's doing there is not making mechanical art, but he's making an art that is going to measure up to a mechanical world. He's going to use mechanical means. And when I say mechanical, I don't mean he's using a machine to make it, but just in the fact of using this unusual tool, which is a device, right? It's a Stanley knife. It's a very unusual tool for making a painting. Normally it's just used for cutting lengths of canvas off. Insert it kind of did that disruption of that mechanical tool into the sort of more, I don't know, privileged space of,
Mm.
expressionist culture that is the typical of a painting. He's really saying something about this is where we need to go. We need to really incorporate mechanical ideas and mechanical methods into our painting. Otherwise, it's just going to be, some sort of throwback. It's not going to be relevant anymore. That's why you get that more machine, that cleaner look, and then the less kind of spontaneous look. It's a real zeitgeist shift that's
Yeah.
happened on both sides of the Atlantic in the 50s and early 60s.
And what did the critics think of his new slashed paintings and his punctured paintings?
Yeah, they were very puzzled. Um, there, there are a lot of jokes about, there's always, if because in a way, Fontana is kind of testing the limits again of what is art, but I don't think to the
Hmm.
same extent as Klein. He has another agenda. People would say, "Oh, that slot there, that's where you put the money in." It's like a money, but because he's making a lot of money out of these paintings after a while. So strangely, people are collecting them, and gradually over time, that's when he really starts to get international notoriety
Hmm.
as a result of these flash paintings. From 61, I mean, 58, 9, it's still happening. 60, 61, 62 is really, it's becoming a big thing. And by that time, although in Italy they were received ambivalently,
Mm.
they were already kind of used to the idea that he was going to do something weird. Um, and, at the same time, it has to be said, he was doing commissions for like people's swimming pools and stuff. Like or making a decorative light ceiling thing. Like he wasn't
Mm.
proud. Like he was an avant-garde artist pushing the boundaries of art, but it wasn't beneath him to produce a decorative scheme in a kind of rococo gilt. Like he'd
Mm.
do this ridiculous, like horses and knights, and it's sort of a bit like Art Deco, a bit kind of Jacobean or something, and it's like this stucco encrusted gold thing. You can't believe the sort of things he was doing. So he always had that. He was always in touch with the kind of, I don't know, like I say, gun for hire. But then he had this
Yeah.
aspect of his practice for which he became most famous. So he got a lot of criticism for these paintings because they're not made out of anything and they're too expensive for not doing enough effort and all that. But then gradually, you've got to think about the fact that the art market is just kind of for avant-garde is really exploding.
Mm.
Pollock. Then you have the next generation of like field painters, and then in America, for example, and they're sort of, I guess, their equivalents in other countries.
Mm.
And then you have minimalism. So by 1961, you've got pop art. 1962, I've got minimalism, which is just in America, for example, just got boxes on the floor, which were works about both our machine culture and industrial culture, but also about the physical presence of the spectator in relation to the work.
Mm.
So he started to attract a following. But the funny thing is, he had a pretty good following in Europe. 1961, 1962, Germany,
Yeah.
Holland. There's a certain kind of Northern European taste, a little bit less so in England. And then he gets quite famous. And then people in Japan are starting to pay attention to him. So
Mm.
there's a movement in Japan called Gutai, where they're doing happenings and they're making artworks out of light globes and they're rolling around in the mud, and that's an artwork. So they were looking at Fontana going, "Oh, you're the guy. Like, you started it all. When you started punching holes in the painting, you were telling us it's time for a change."
Mm.
He was one of those artists who really inspired younger people. But then he's like, "Great, I'm going to have an exhibition in New York." So, because I'm so famous and so popular. I mean, he wasn't vain, I think, but he probably thought he's getting interest from the US, certain collectors. I mean, his work's in big collections, private
Mm.
collections, and has been for years over there. Anyway, so he gets this show going with Martha Jackson Gallery, who showed pop art and avant-garde or neo-dada art in New York. Anyway, so he turns up with these paintings, and they're called Venice paintings, right? So they're these punctured paintings. He's gone back to doing punctured paintings again because he just, I don't know, just I kind of like doing that, so I'll do it again. But they're punctured paintings covered in these blobs of like goo, this bright pink, acid yellow in rivulets, sort of painted with his hand. And then there's cuts in them, and then there's these chunks of colored glass, and they're sort of awful. Like, it's very hard to understand what he was doing, but you have to understand it's like when we look at a Warhol painting, we see Marilyn Monroe made in like lime green and, hot pink or whatever. You go, "Oh, yeah, I get it. It's like something about mass culture." What Fontana was doing was the same thing, but just about Italian mass culture.
Yeah.
You go to Italy, white columns, gold everywhere, gold telephone, all this kind of stuff,
Mm.
cheesy marble, like Murano, cheesy chandeliers made out of colored glass. Like, there's an Italian kitsch which is different to the American kitsch. So when you can read it, I've spent a lot of time in Italy and lived in Milan and everything, you sort of can read it. It's like a bit of an in-joke. It totally fell flat in New York. Everybody thought it was absolute garbage. Just all the reviews were atrociously bad. So I opened my book. I really wanted to put Fontana in place in a physical place like New York
Yeah.
and make it more relatable to him, because it hadn't been written much about in English at that point. But also to sort of get people to understand where's the gap? Why hasn't he been appreciated, and how is it for an English speaking audience? What are we missing? So I explain in great detail. So I go into, I mean, I like wallowing in the negative reviews because they're actually quite funny. And the funny thing is, some of the negative reviews actually absolutely right on the mark about what he's trying to do. They just got
Mm.
the valorization wrong. Like, that's exactly what he was trying to, push your buttons about. This is kind of gross and cheesy and cheap and kind of spectacular. Like, what are you doing? There's an aspect of his work where I think he's also trying to say, these paintings, they're kind of terrible because they shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
We should have spatial art.
Mm.
So let's just have fun with it while it lasts, but it's not going to be here in the future. Like, that was his thinking. I
Yeah.
mean, the death knell of painting has been rung many times, and it's sort of still there, but those were the days, right? So the criticism of the early slash paintings and then what followed had a very varied and a checkered reception history. And it took a while for Americans and English speaking people to really get the joke, I suppose, or
Yeah.
not the joke, but kind of what was the intention. And Fontana, because he was a little bit of he was a bit easy, like he liked work, he liked making people happy, he liked making stuff. People wanted
Hmm.
to pay him. He kind of made a lot of weird stuff, like as well, like I was saying before, decorative stuff. So I
Yeah.
think that kind of muddied the waters for people because in the English speaking world, that's kind of no, you're either a painter or you're a decorator. You can't be both. But in Italy, that doesn't work.
Mm.
Michelangelo was a decorator, right?
Yeah.
Look at
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Fontana
Definitely.
said. Look at the ceiling. Like that's decoration, man.
Yeah. How does your because we've just talked a little bit about criticism. How does your book address the accusation that the slashes are simplistic?
Yeah, it does it by, I suppose, first of all, building up the trajectory that led him to that point. I mean,
Hmm.
I think it's a little bit, it sometimes when you produce something, it can, when you say somebody's really good at something, they make it look effortless.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit the same with Fontana. And there's a couple of things to say about it. First of all, it was decades of thinking that were necessary to reach that point.
Mm.
Also, you know, nobody is isolated. Like he was surrounded by people thinking about these issues. So, I talked about Yves Klein before. We talked about Duchamp. We talked about Pollock.
Mm.
And then you add in a myriad of other things. You talk about fascism, right? Like he experienced as I say, instrumentalization or, turning of art into propaganda, advertising, and, messaging, firsthand. In some cases willingly, but when you understand the background to how he got there, when you understand his theory of spatial art, you can see that the slash paintings, as I said earlier, actually are the closest thing to the spatial artwork because they manifest something that is literally made out of space within, however, the confines of an illusionistic painting. So it's kind of a contradiction. The last thing I would say about the simplicity thing is that it looks, as you probably thought I would say, it looks a lot easier than it is.
Mm.
And the reason I say that is to produce the desired effect and appearance of the completely seamless, unblemished surface, evenly coated with no sort of imperfections. Then, when you have a stretch painting, right, it has a certain kind of, it's like a bridge, right? Like it's got its stresses. I'm not an engineer, but there's stress and there's the gravity and there's all sorts of things going on, and it has to
Mm.
sort of hold together like a tensile sort of structure. When you cut into a painting like that, it messes up with the structure because the fiber is of a certain quality, and so it's pulling against itself. When it's wrapped around a canvas stretcher bar,
Mm.
if you cut it the wrong way, it'll just flop. It'll just become this kind of mess. It won't be taut. So he has to produce the desired effect of this sort of illusion of a space within a space. He has to produce this finely engineered, structured,
Yeah.
seamless perfection surface, and also uh, think about scale. Like there's so many things to think about. Also, the way he painted them, there's a bit of a mystery around this, but he talked about kind of dipping them in paint, and so all sorts of. And also, the funny thing is, he never ever showed how he made the painting to anybody.
Mm.
There are famous photographs of
Yeah.
him with a knife. And if you think, oh, he's making the painting, there's even got one where you can see his hand blurring and the cut's there and the hand is blurring at the bottom. You think, oh, he must have just done it. It's all phony. He
Oh
he
wow.
he he said to the photographer, I'm not making a painting in front of you. Forget it. Don't film me. I'll
So it
pretend.
was all posed.
Yeah, he pretended to make it.
Wow.
Didn't want anyone to see how he did it. Now you might say, yeah, that's because it was too easy. I actually think he had a certain kind of integrity that he wouldn't do it for an audience. It was a contemplative thing. It had to be for him and the work, and that's it. So with other artists like Yves Klein, I must say I do think the kind of theatricality, John, what you said before is quite right, that's part of the work. But
Mm.
that wasn't the ethos of Fontana. He wasn't.
Yeah.
He didn't. He actually was a beautifully dressed man. He spoke very elegantly. He was always turned out exquisite, like Prince of Wales check with a canary yellow shirt and his beautifully groomed mustache. He loved looking good,
Mm.
and he knew
Yeah.
how to put on a show as far as like make a statement that was a little bit quirky or puzzling, but he wouldn't be this sort of like Barnum and Bailey thing, which I think is where Yves Klein is going. I mean, that's sort of where art has gone, right? But that
Yeah.
Fontana was of an older generation to much older than Klein. Like, and Klein looked up to him. You know, he would say, "Oh, Klein would come and meet me when I went to Paris. He would come and meet me at the station, and show me around, and like I was like the Queen of Sheba." So Fontana was that older generation. Like I said,
Mm.
respected craft, respected the integrity of his practice, while doing these extraordinary things, which are deceptively simple but are incredibly complex physically and conceptually. I suppose has been my response.
And where would your book place him, situate Fontana in modernism or popular culture?
Yes, that's a good question. So the the fact is that Fontana modernism, the history of modernism, has its own history. So
Mm.
briefly, just it was sort of dominated. So there's modernism in literature, there's modernism in religion, there's modernism in science, I think, But if we just talk about painting, what has come to be understood as modernism basically refers to post World War II abstract painting in America and then sort of what followed. We can talk about late 19th century painting as modernism. People sometimes say Manet or the Impressionists were modernists, but the real canonical modernism, like modernist painting, what people are taught in universities and schools and, docent talks in galleries around the world, is that,
Mm.
abstract painting and abstraction. Pollock was there, and then there are other artists that came afterwards. People like Kenneth Noland and Morris Lewis. They were all large-scale abstract paintings, and it became to be modernism came to be quite high and mighty. It
Mm.
started to get almost like another form of neoclassicism, large-scale, pure surfaces. You know,
Mm.
not down and dirty, not part of like mass culture. It was a very, I guess, rarefied scene, the modernism that was happening at the time Fontana was sort of in his prime. And so what I say is that because that became abstraction and all that sort of became the dominant sort of idea of what advanced art looked like or what modernism should look like after World War II, partly in reaction to, fascism, and communism, which were both pro figuration and pro realism. It was sort of like a backlash to that. Um, they didn't get down into like everyday life. They didn't want to have representation of anything. They didn't want to have narrative on anything. It became very rarefied. So
Mm.
Fontana, even though he was abstract, because of that kitsch element of his work, and the sort of just really unconventional aspect of his work, the cultural references, the use of the knife and everything, he actually was outside the history of modernism. He was sort of seen as a problem. People could accept maybe the slash paintings and the monochrome surfaces, but they couldn't accept all the other stuff. So I would say Fontana was not accepted within the canonical modernist history.
Mm.
And it's only been in recent times that we've now started to see that history has been sort of oppressive, and
Yeah.
there's only been certain people who were allowed in and everybody else was kept out. And it was, New York, Paris, Berlin, places like Milan. It's like, go away and have a plate of pasta. Like there was really
Yeah.
this sort of bias against Italian. I would say, and Argentinian as well. So now I think hopefully through my work and the work of my supervisor who has also written on Yves Lambois, who has also written on Fontana, and now some newer scholars who are coming up,
Hmm.
particularly in the English speaking world, have started to reinsert Fontana. And when you reinsert Fontana into the history of modernism, modernism doesn't look the same anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
It isn't the same. And it's troubling because, first of all, how do you deal with an avant-garde artist who was also a fascist, for starters? Because modernism's guarantee of like authenticity was the fact
Yeah.
that it was kind of progressive. But Fontana messes with that. And then modernism in a certain period, like obviously there's pop art and everything, but that itself was a kind of reaction to the modernism I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I see Fontana, if you had to think about him very crudely, he's sort of like a pop artist just for Italy with a bit of, you know, abstraction thrown in. But you asked me about popular culture. Fontana hasn't hasn't broken into popular culture in a way. Like he wanted to be popular. His works were popular as far as he produced hundreds and hundreds of these paintings.
Hmm.
Uh, he wanted, that's why he kept working. He loved working. He loved producing work and making people happy, as I say. But, he hasn't sort of made that crossover where you would say, I don't know, some artists have kind of become, I don't know, household names. Keith Haring, I don't know, someone like, or Picasso, or I don't know, Roy Lichtenstein. You see him on
Mm.
T-shirts. I mean, he hasn't kind of had that thing happen to him. I mean, Kandinsky maybe even, or Paul Klee has sort of like become part of popular culture. Um, but uh, what he did do, I think, is totally break down and eliminate the distinction, to my mind, between high art, as it used to be called, or fine art and
Mm.
mass culture or popular culture in really interesting ways. I mean, think about the fact that he used, fluorescent tubing. Think about the fact that he used fluorescent paint, that he used ultraviolet light, that he used glitter,
Yeah.
sequins, right? I mean, all these things. He made paintings out of copper, made with a hammer and chisel and copper. I mean, he really did disturb the kind of common boundaries between decoration and sort of like fine arts, between mass culture and high culture, and also between what is a progressive, forward-thinking art and what is a sort of maybe regressive in a sense. I mean, I don't mean just fascism, but what I was saying earlier, by retaining the idea of the hand as the absolutely fundamental component of this otherwise quite mechanical art. He kind of even breaks that distinction, which is seen to be kind of essential. It's either authentic because it's human, or it's inauthentic because it's a machine, or it's authentic
Mm.
as a machine. So, there's all different ways. So yeah, part of mass culture, not quite, but I very much informed by and very much, wanting to, I guess, engage with popular and with popular culture. I mean, and obviously the television project was very much a part of that.
Well, personally, I love his art because the the punches and the slash, you can feel the physical intervention in that art.
Mm, mm.
Um, but how did critics interpret Fontana's art after his death? Has it
Yeah,
grown
so
or?
yeah, he had. I mean, he had kept producing right up till the end. He was in Documenta, I think in might get the date wrong. I think 66. So he dies in 68. Which
Yeah.
is interesting, right? That he dies in 68. I think September, like May 68, right? It's this
Hmm.
moment, and he's not part of it. That's not him. He's only young. He's 68, 69. Um, so he was understood as an essential stepping stone in the story of Italian modern art, in Italy. So in Italy, there are artists like him, like Alberto Burri, who many of you, the people watching this, listening, may not know, who's about the same age, a little bit younger, produced paintings out of Hessian sacks, and with rips and tears in them. And he was huge at a certain point. So artists like Fontana and Burri, for the younger generation of artists I'm talking about now more than critics, because they're the sort of critics, they're doing their criticism with art, yeah. So you can tell when you look at the next generation of artists, which is essentially is arte povera, right? You think of Michelangelo Pistoletto or Giuseppe Pennone. They're making works out of paper mache, out of sacks, out of wool, just have piled on the floor. You know, balls of cotton soaking up water or something, or a piece of granite with a compass inside of it, like stuff that was very physical and very material,
Mm.
and also those stuff that was conceptual. So Anselmo's Torsione, which is a work, or tension, which is a work, a big bar is tangled up in a piece of leather and twisted and twisted and twisted and twisted until it's like taut. and it would
Mm.
unravel. And it's now to war, and it's tension. Like it's the idea of tension. That's such an it's potential energy, you know.
Yeah.
So these artists, they might seem quite distant to Fontana, and they're certainly pushing the boundaries a lot further, but they have different concerns. But it's hard to see that without Fontana, thinking about technology, thinking about what is the definition of art, totally transforming the idea of what an artistic material can be. It's hard to imagine that next generation even happening.
Yeah.
So in the 60s, 70s, he sort of becomes eclipsed, right? Art that's more political, art that's more conceptual, but there's a respect in Italy for him. Outside of Italy, it's
Mm.
crickets.
Right.
Uh, it just doesn't fit, you know, this sort of really pure, you know, he gets very analytical conceptual art in the 60s, and then the 70s, you know, things move on, right? You know,
Yeah.
feminism, you have, you know, a whole lot of different art movements, and 80s, you have postmodernism and so forth. So, you know, you have all these different movements, and Fontana gets kind of left behind, and he only gets really rediscovered, I think, mostly through the show at the Pompidou, which is the big art gallery in Paris, the modern art
Mm.
gallery there. There's a big retrospective there in about 86, and then gradually, you know, he sort of comes into view again. And I think because the art world became, there's something sort of happened after the 80s, everything sort of became scattered. Like it was like that was the end of like a move. There's no movements, you know, there's no trend, there's no progress, there's nothing. It's just kind of people making art.
Mm.
So I think there used to be this idea that like you had to be part of the solution or you're part of the problem, you know? Like if you're not progressing art, if you're not becoming more and more radical all the time, you know, or becoming pure or becoming more wild or crazy or whatever, like you're not with Fontana, his work doesn't fit that mold because he's so
Mm.
various and also combines
Yeah.
different things in one work. So he sort of got pushed aside. But I think from the 90s onwards, and personally for me, I suppose when if I may say, I'm part of this reconsideration of Fontana.
Mm.
What attracted me to him were two things. First of all, the mixture of mass culture and modernism. And the second thing was the whole idea of like, where does fascism fit into the history of modernism? And for those two reasons, because there was this whole thing like modernism, mass culture, no, right? That's for the plebs. We're going to do our highfalutin, no. With fascism, it's like absolute no. Like if you're a modern artist, you're not a fascist, and if you're a fascist, you can't be a modern artist. This is absolutely wrong.
Mm.
Well, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
what happened.
Of course.
The history tells you a different story. So but I think we sort of get that now. I think we understand that, you know, things like, oh, the sexual revolution was just another way for men to oppress women. You know, we
Mm.
thought it was all progressive, but actually it was worse in a way. I mean, of course, it had some good points. You know, we used to think, I don't know, all sorts of things that are progress or are all just one thing, that they're not the opposite. But it turns out that things are not what they seem. So too with the history of modern art. And I think uh, the thing that has really changed now is that we can look at a Fontana and go, even though it looks so unorthodox and so unexpected and a mixture of so many different things, it seems progressive and regressive at the same time. It seems like conceptual, but also sort of worldly at the same time. It seems showy, but also rigorous.
Mm.
We're more used to that. Like nobody is just one thing. And I think it was only really perhaps in the last 20 years or so that we've been able to kind of let go of a lot of those ideas that, you know, if you weren't abstract, you were nothing. If you weren't pure formalism, you were nothing.
Mm.
If you weren't above the fray of like advertising, all that, you were terrible. You know, like all those things.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's changed. And I also think one of the beautiful things about Fontana that maybe speaks to today's reality is that there's a certain melancholy aspect to Fontana's work, which I think, you know, we don't live in an age where we sort of believe things like, if we do this, then this will happen, you know, like
Mm.
there's a lot of
Yeah.
disillusionment. I mean, maybe I'm speaking of my generation rather than younger generation, but so many dreams and hopes have fallen, right? So Fontana's work, in a way, speaks to that very deeply because, you know, he'd been through it all, right? He'd been propaganda artist, and then realized that was a mistake. He got involved in fascism, he got involved in commerce, he got involved in all sorts of things. And then he kind
Mm.
of came up with this idea, I'm going to make an artwork that's going to change the world. And then actually it turned out it couldn't make it really quite in the way that he wanted to. Because a spatial artwork, like I said before, is a physical and conceptual impossibilty. You can't make an
Yeah.
artwork out of space. If you do, it's not there, so it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of, I see a certain sort of melancholy in these slash paintings, that almost in frustration, and also in this sort of damage he does to the paintings, not only with the violence, but he's sort of damaged them by making them look sort of sometimes kind of cheesy.
Mm.
If you understand, like, you know what, if I can't get what I want, I'm just going to trash the joint. And I think there's that sort of sadness, sort of frustration, but still hoping that maybe somehow one day this dream of an artwork that is truly connected to space and thereby more a part of everyday life, like importantly, more accessible to everybody, not some rarefied thing only for, rich people,
Mm.
might actually happen. So I think it speaks to that. I personally think his work speaks to that sort of present problem, and perhaps that will be the key to his sort of his resilience, like as the years go by.
Thank you. Um, my penultimate question is, how does your book resolve the tension between utopia and kitsch?
Yeah. So there is a tension there, obviously, and it's a provocative title. Like I actually thought of changing it, but the
That's
feedback
a
I
great
got,
title.
yeah, and it's because it's sort of counterintuitive, right? I mean,
Mm.
deliberately counterintuitive. It does say between. So the tension is that, in my mind, on the one hand, the kitsch is the end of utopia, right? Utopia would be a perfect world where everything was great and everything worked.
Mm.
Kitsch is a world where everything's kind of a bit shit, excuse my French, or a bit cheesy, or
Yeah.
fake, or not quite right, or sort of lazy, like relying on things that we already like. We all know that a sad puppy will produce an emotion, but like,
Mm.
how'd you do better than that? Like that's kitsch, right? So, and some of his work, using glitter and hot pink is like, what are you doing? It's sort of like pushing all the buttons, too many at once. So that's not utopia. Utopia would be, oh no, everything is perfect and ordered and it's all logical and it all pans out and everybody's happy at the end.
Mm.
Kitsch is like the hamburger version of, like, the fine dining. So you don't get that sort of sense of beauty and satisfaction. You get the quick, fun, kind of slightly distasteful version of the truth. So that they're supposed to be opposites. So in a sense, I'm saying they are. He kind of, like, in a way, his work ends up in that world because he can't achieve the
Mhm.
utopia. But there's another sense in which we're between utopia and kitsch as well, which is this, that there's a point at which they kind of overlap. And what I mean by that is, as I was saying earlier, if you use materials from popular culture, from discos, from advertising, from uh, glamour, celebrity culture. If you use all those materials in art, there's one reading of that which would be, well, you're a sellout. You've sort of like given up on trying to make, because you're just buying into all this cheap stuff that's just making the world worse. But there's also
Mm.
another side of it, which is that, without the emotion and without the fun and without the sensuality and the spectacularity of all those extraordinary modern materials that are just so much part of our life, if you seek to exterminate all of that or leave it out of the picture, you're going to create a horrible world. Like,
Mm.
so I think between utopia and kitsch is like, yes, those two things are opposed, and yet paradoxically, you can't have one without the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Like a
I guess
yin,
that's
like
how
a
I
yin and a
see.
yang.
yin and yang. I mean, the word I use in the book is dialectical, which
Yeah.
is not podcast ready, I don't think. But I think we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. Can't have
yeah,
one without the other.
yeah. And my last question, I mean, when I look at art, I'm looking at Yves Klein, I'm looking at Willem de Kooning,
Oh yeah,
you know,
great
and
artist.
Hans Hoffman,
Yes,
people like that.
great artist.
What about today's artists? Do you see any hope of like real good art today?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I have spent most of my life looking at modern art, by which I mean 20th century art.
Hmm.
And um, I have neglected, right, to look at contemporary art.
Hmm.
But in April, I was in New York, um, and I went to some exhibitions. And I went to see an exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art,
Hmm.
and I went to see an exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum of Art. And both artists were African American artists.
Yeah.
Both artists were living artists, youngish, like
Hmm.
maybe in their 40s. They
Yeah.
had retrospectives sell out because I'm of an older generation. Can't remember their names, but the point I will make is this. And I went to the Whitney and I saw the exhibition of this artist, a female artist who's famous for doing this wonderful portrait of Michelle Obama.
Hmm.
It's quite extraordinary. It's sort of like a mixture between Alex Katz and Alice Neal, and it's a bit, I don't want to say pop art, but it's a slightly iconic, hieratic, but also realistic pop versions of portraiture.
Yeah.
But the main thing that I remember thinking, and I'm very embarrassed I can't remember the name, but that's okay. I'm not desperately going to look it up on phone because that would be even worse. I was sitting in the gallery in the Whitney going, and at the Guggenheim, I'm looking around, there's a lot of African American people here in this gallery.
Hmm.
And, I've been to New York many, many times over many, many years, not so much lately for reasons you might divine.
Yeah.
And I don't remember seeing that many African American people in the museum.
Hmm.
Mostly they were the guards, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, in the 90s, I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was amazing, like they were talking vigorously, discussing the art, and talking about it. And it was for them, right? The art was for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was beautiful. And it was really interesting. The other artist, again, I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name at the Guggenheim. I really struggled with it at first. I was like, I can't understand this. But then gradually, because I didn't understand the background, didn't understand the story. Once I got into it, I just fell in love with it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I think with contemporary art, it's supposed to be frightening, irritating, boring, confusing, like
Mm.
that's its job. And it's sometimes for someone like me who's really a 20th century art expert, it's easy for me to get stuck.
Mm.
But when I
Yeah.
teach, I'm surrounded by young people who are bringing ideas to me that, I thank God I actually do keep up a little bit. But no, you just have to remain open. So I think there are great artists out there. And I mean, the sign that these artists were in these major institutions, I'm sorry to be so New York centric, but it's kind of like, my second home, apart from not having been there recently. Um, there really is great contemporary art out there, but you have to know how to understand it. And sometimes the truth is, it's not really for you,
Mm.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah. 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 I do. Yeah.
And that was the thing that I learned. And then it was up to me not to just go, well, why don't I understand it? I had to understand it. I had to make the effort to understand, by
Yeah.
kind of, sharing it with the people who did understand. So anyway, I hope that it's a bit of an abstract. I'm not going to give you names of artists because I can't remember them, but I do have a lot of faith in. The art world has a lot of problems, money laundering,
Yeah.
etc., etc. Um, but 'twas ever thus, right? Look at the Medici. We have great art. continuing to be made, in spite of everything. It's getting more difficult in the USA, obviously.
Yeah.
But in April 2025, it was still happening.
Mm. Well, I think some great art will come out of the situation that's happening over there at the minute.
Inevitably, if they are able to show it,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's increasingly the problem. But maybe I hate to say that I don't want artists to have to suffer before they produce a masterpiece, but
yeah.
uh, let's hope. Let's hope.
So, Professor Anthony White, what's next for you?
Great question. I'm working on a couple of different projects. So I have recently completed a long project on what used to be called outsider art. So, artists who are untrained or maybe have lived on the margins of society. So,
Mhm.
sort of taken my interest in the avant-garde and transplanted it onto. I'm often interested in art that is below the radar, if you know what I mean. Like
Yeah,
Fontana was
yeah.
below the radar when I started working on him. Now he's sort of too famous, so I have to move on. And then I've been working. You mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, the mapping creativity and captivity project. So I'm very interested in the history of incarceration, particularly in Australia, and particularly within that of internment of civilians in World War II, which happened.
Oh, wow.
So four or five
Okay.
thousand Italian, just to focus on the Italians, were four to 5,000 Italian men mostly were imprisoned during the war here as enemy aliens, and about 18,000 prisoners of war who were Italian were imprisoned here in Australia.
Hmm.
And because of my interest in Italian art, I was invited to participate in this project. And also, I've got a personal interest because my great uncle, who fought in Gallipoli, amazingly survived that and then was a guard at one of the internment camps in a place called Tuchura, which is in country Victoria, which is in the southern state of Australia. So I feel a personal connection. It's out.
Yeah.
Australia has a great history of locking people up, John. You might know that.
Yeah.
And but because yes, a lot of the people who were arrested, I mean, the prisoners of war, they were shooting at us, so I guess okay. But the people who were living here, they thought they were Australians, and then 1940, they were enemies, and then they were locked up. Most of them for no good reason.
Well,
So they
I'd be
made art. They made art. They made literature. They made theatre. They did amazing things. So there's so much to talk about. And then the next project I'm thinking about something on maybe British futurism would be the next. So anyway,
yeah.
that's a long way off.
Well, I'd be interested in the World War Two because my other podcast is on World War Two. So
I noticed that, and I will definitely look at it. And there's a lot to this. I've written a whole book about Italian art and fascism, in the lead up to World War II. So I'm very interested in that whole. I can't seem to get out of it. I'm stuck there. That's okay. That's my
awesome.
place, I suppose.
Well, Professor Anthony White, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I loved your book, and I
Thank you.
learned so much from that, and I've learned so much from this conversation today. So
Oh, that's very kind of you.
thank you so much for joining me.
It was a really great pleasure, John. I was delighted to be have the opportunity to have this conversation. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Take care
All
now.
right, John. Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye.